Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1870. The American frontier, a vast and unforgiving landscape where law was often just a distant concept, where settlers sought fortune and a new beginning. Labette County, Kansas, a place of opportunity, of open prairies and scattered homesteads, a place where travelers disappeared, where the earth itself seemed to swallow people whole. Kansas, in 1870, was still a raw and developing territory. The state had entered the Union just 9 years earlier, in 1861, amidst the turmoil of the Civil War. The conflict had left deep scars across the region, with memories of bleeding Kansas still fresh in the minds of many residents. Homesteaders were flooding in, drawn by the promise of the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of public land to any adult citizen who had never taken up arms against the United States government. The southeastern corner of Kansas, where Labette County sits, was particularly attractive to settlers. The land was fertile, the Great Plains stretching out in seemingly endless possibility. The Osage Trail, once a Native American pathway, had become a crucial route for settlers, merchants, and fortune seekers heading west. Daily wagons would creak along this dusty trail, carrying the hopes and possessions of those seeking a new life. It was in this landscape of opportunity and transience that a small cabin appeared in 1870, approximately 16 miles northeast of where Parsons, Kansas, stands today. A modest structure, part grocery store, part inn, operated by a family of 4 who introduced themselves as the Benders. John Bender Sr., his wife Almira, often called Ma, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate. Simple folk, they claimed, immigrants seeking the American dream. But dreams in Kansas sometimes twisted into nightmares. By the spring of 1873, at least 11 travelers would vanish along this stretch of trail. 11 souls who stopped for a meal or a night's rest, never to continue their journey. The Bender cabin, sitting innocuously on the prairie, concealed horrors that would not be discovered until it was too late. This is not a tale of ghosts or supernatural phenomena. This is the documented account of what many consider America's first serial-killing family, the Bloody Benders of Kansas. The period following the Civil War saw significant movement across the American frontier. Veterans from both sides sought new beginnings away from the devastated landscapes of the East. Immigrant families arrived daily at eastern ports, many continuing westward in search of land and opportunity. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, had opened new possibilities for travel, though many routes, including the Osage Trail, remained accessible only by wagon or horseback. Labette County itself was established in 1867 and named after Labette Creek that runs through the region. The county seat was initially located in Oswego, but would later move to Parsons after that town was established in 1871. According to census records, the county's population in 1870 was approximately 9,173 residents scattered across the rolling prairie in small communities and isolated homesteads. The cabin still stands in memory, if not in physical form. A simple structure, roughly 16 by 24 feet, divided by a canvas curtain. The front half served as a grocery store and dining area for weary travelers. The back half, hidden behind that innocent curtain, was the family's private quarters, a place no outsider was meant to see. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the calculated normalcy the family maintained. The way they inserted themselves into a community, presented themselves as hard-working immigrants, all while systematically eliminating those who crossed their threshold. According to county records from 1870, John Bender Sr. claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act. A German immigrant, his English was poor, his manner described as grim and unfriendly by those who interacted with him. Local accounts describe him as a man of medium height with a perpetual scowl. His beard was unkempt, his clothing often soiled from working the land. Those few who engaged him in conversation noted how his eyes never seemed to meet theirs, always darting about as if watching for something approaching from a distance. The Homestead Act required claimants to improve the land by building a dwelling and cultivating crops. The Benders did the minimum necessary to maintain their claim, constructing the cabin and planting a small orchard of apple trees behind it. They cleared perhaps 10 acres for crops, though neighbors noted that their agricultural efforts seemed half-hearted at best. Heinrich Schmidt, who owned land 2 miles east, later testified, "The old man Bender, he did not farm like a man who cares for the land. He scratched at the soil like a chicken, just enough to say he had planted. When I tried to offer advice about crop rotation, he stared at me as if I spoke in tongues, though I addressed him in our native German." His wife, a large woman of imposing stature, was said to speak even less English than her husband. Many who encountered her described her as masculine and threatening. Some accounts suggest she could only speak in guttural sounds and unintelligible phrases. Township records describe her as being near 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that showed the calluses of hard labor. Her face was weathered, seemingly incapable of forming a smile. Local children would cross to the other side of the trail to avoid passing directly by her when she stood outside the cabin. Ma Bender's origins were as obscure as her husband's. Some accounts suggest she was not German at all, but perhaps of Dutch or Scandinavian descent. Her age was estimated to be between 45 and 55. Those who interacted with her noted that she wore the same faded blue dress almost daily, covered by a stained apron that bore evidence of her work in the cabin's kitchen. Reverend William Wakefield, the circuit preacher who occasionally held services in the area, wrote in his journal in February 1872, called upon the Bender family today to invite them to Sunday service. The woman of the house greeted me with such a fearsome countenance that I nearly forgot my Christian purpose. When I mentioned the Lord's work, she made a sound like the growling of a dog and turned away. There are souls in need of salvation in that house, but I confess a reluctance to return. Their son, John Jr., was described as a man of limited intelligence, possibly suffering from some cognitive impairment. According to statements given to the Labette County Sheriff in 1873, neighbors noted that John Jr. would often be seen wandering the property at odd hours, muttering to himself. He was tall like his mother, but thin, almost gaunt. His clothing hung loosely on his frame. One neighbor, a Mr. Garrett, stated that John Jr. had once visited his farm to purchase eggs, and during the entire transaction had giggled periodically for no apparent reason. John Jr. was believed to be in his mid-20s. He occasionally worked as a day laborer for surrounding farms, though employers noted his work was often substandard. He seemed to have difficulty following basic instructions and would sometimes abandon tasks midway through completion. Dr. Nathan Lawson, who practiced medicine in Parsons, encountered John Jr. in town in the summer of 1872. In a letter to a colleague, Lawson wrote, "I was approached today by the young Bender man, who complained of headaches. Upon examination, I noted several peculiarities in his manner and speech that suggest congenital deficiencies of the mind. His cranial formation exhibits certain abnormalities consistent with cases of mental retardation I studied during my time in Philadelphia. Despite his imposing physical stature, he exhibits the understanding of a child of perhaps 8 or 9 years. But it was their daughter Kate who stands out most prominently in historical records. Kate Bender, unlike her family, spoke fluent English. She was described as attractive, educated, and charming. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned her advertising herself as a spiritualist and healer who could cure illnesses through her magnetic powers. The Parsons Eagle carried an advertisement in its October 1871 issue in which Kate offered to communicate with spirits and heal the afflicted for a modest fee. Kate was approximately 23 years old, when the family settled in Labette County. She had auburn hair, according to multiple accounts, and carried herself with uncommon confidence for a frontier woman. Unlike her family members, she engaged freely with the community, attending local gatherings and church services. Her charm was noted by several male residents, including the editor of the local newspaper, who described her as a woman of uncommon intelligence and pleasing demeanor. Professor James Cunningham of the Oswego Seminary met Kate at a public lecture on spiritualism in January 1872. His diary entry from that evening reads, "Among the attendees was a striking young woman who identified herself as Miss Kate Bender. She demonstrated a surprising familiarity with the spiritualist literature, citing Andrew Jackson Davis and Emanuel Swedenborg with the ease of a scholar. Her questions were incisive and showed an intellect far superior to what one might expect from her station. I found myself wondering how such a refined young woman came to be the daughter of the crude German immigrant family about whom I have heard whispers. The question of whether Kate was actually a blood relation to the other Benders remains unresolved. Some historical accounts suggest she may have been unrelated, perhaps a companion of John Jr., who assumed the role of daughter for the purpose of their criminal enterprise. Census records provide no clarity on this matter, as the family appears to have avoided official documentation whenever possible. County records show that the Benders established their small inn and grocery in 1871. The location was strategic, positioned along the Osage Trail, a well-traveled route used by settlers, merchants, and travelers heading west. The establishment seemed legitimate. They sold basic supplies, offered meals, and provided overnight accommodations for a modest fee. The grocery stock was minimal: flour, coffee, tobacco, canned goods, and basic dry goods. The meals served were simple but filling, typically consisting of bread, salt pork or beef, and coffee. Travelers could sleep on crude pallets in the main room for 25 cents per night, or, if they preferred privacy, could pay 50 cents to sleep in the wagon shed behind the cabin. But something wasn't right about the Bender place, something that locals couldn't quite put their finger on. Mr. Thomas Ewers, who owned the adjacent property to the east, later told investigators that he had noticed odd behaviors. The Benders would often work in their fields well after sunset, barely visible in the gathering darkness. On moonlit nights, he sometimes observed them digging in the orchard behind their cabin. When questioned about this activity, John Sr. had claimed they were planting fruit trees, but Ewers noted that the digging occurred in different locations and at irregular intervals. Ewers stated in his official testimony, "I recall one night in the fall of '72, must have been October by the harvest moon, I was returning late from Cherryvale and passed by the Bender place. The hour was well past midnight, yet I saw lantern light among the trees in their orchard. I thought it strange that anyone would be tending trees at such an hour. The next day I mentioned it to Old Man Bender, and he claimed they had been setting out new saplings that had just arrived. But there was frost that night, and no farmer with sense plants trees in a frost." The cabin's layout would later prove significant. Diners would be seated with their backs to the canvas curtain that divided the cabin. Behind this curtain, out of sight, the family could prepare. For what exactly would only become clear later. A ledger recovered from the property showed that between May 1871 and March 1873, the Benders had recorded transactions with over 100 travelers. Yet neighbors reported seeing far fewer people actually stopping at the inn. When questioned about this discrepancy after the discoveries, no one could provide a satisfactory explanation. The first documented disappearance connected to the area occurred in May 1871. A man named Jones, a cattle dealer from Georgia, was traveling through Kansas with $3,000 in cash, a substantial sum at the time. He was last seen heading toward the Bender property. When he failed to reach his destination, his associates initiated a search. Nothing was found. Further research has revealed that this man was likely Charles Jones of Atlanta, Georgia. who had traveled to Kansas to purchase cattle for his expanding butchery business. Bank records from Atlanta confirm that Jones withdrew $3,000 in gold certificates before departing. His business partner, Frederick Walton, traveled to Kansas in June 1871 to search for Jones when no word came of his arrival or the cattle purchase. Walton's journal, discovered among his effects after his own death in 1890, contains this entry from June 12, 1871. No sign of Charles anywhere. Have spoken with the station master at Cherryvale, who recalls a man matching Charles's description, arriving approximately May 8th. The man inquired about lodging along the Osage Trail and was directed to several establishments, including a new grocery operated by a German family. I visited this place today, a crude cabin occupied by unfriendly folk. The old man claimed no memory of Charles, though his daughter, a surprisingly refined young woman, offered to consult spirits to help locate him. I declined this unusual offer. The disappearance was noted in local records, but in frontier Kansas, men sometimes vanished. The wilderness was vast. Native American conflicts still occurred, and outlaws roamed freely. One missing man did not raise significant alarm. In August 1871, a man named Bird, a visitor from Illinois, disappeared after telling associates he planned to stay at the Bender Inn. His horse was later found wandering loose near Fort Scott, some 30 miles away. But Bird himself was never located. This was Henry Bird, a hardware merchant from Springfield, Illinois. According to business correspondence recovered by his family, Bird had traveled to Kansas to assess the possibility of opening a branch store in the growing town of Independence. He had written to his wife on August 10, 1871, "I shall stay tonight at a wayside inn some miles northeast of Independence. The journey has been wearying, and I look forward to a hot meal and rest before continuing to Independence tomorrow. I should arrive there by midday." When Bird failed to arrive in Independence, inquiries were made along his expected route. The stablemaster in Cherryvale recalled directing Bird to the Bender Inn. When questioned, Kate Bender claimed that Bird had indeed stopped for a meal, but had continued on his journey before nightfall. In October of the same year, two German immigrants, names recorded only as Fichte and Hoffman in township documents, vanished while traveling westward along the Osage Trail. Their wagon was discovered abandoned approximately 5 miles west of the Bender property. Local authorities suspected robbery by the numerous outlaw gangs that operated in the territory. Further investigation has identified these men as Johann Fichte and Karl Hoffman, recent arrivals from Bremen, Germany. They had purchased land near Fort Scott and were traveling to inspect their new property when they disappeared. Their wagon, when discovered, contained only their personal belongings. A sum of $800, which bank records show they had withdrawn in Cherryvale, was missing. Over the following months, others would go missing along the same stretch of trail. A father and daughter, George Launcher and his 8-year-old Mary Ann, disappeared in November 1872 while traveling to Iowa after the death of Mrs. Launcher. George had sold their property in Independence, Kansas, and was carrying over $2,500 in cash, according to bank records from the time. The Launcher case would later prove particularly heartrending. George Launcher was a widower whose wife Sarah had died of tuberculosis in October 1872. Unable to manage both his blacksmith business and care for his daughter alone, Launcher had decided to relocate to Iowa, where his wife's sister had offered to help raise Mary Ann. He had sold his business and property for a substantial sum, intending to establish a new smithy in Iowa. A letter from Sarah Launcher's sister, Emily Patterson, to the sheriff's office, dated December 18, 1872, reads, "We expected George and Mary Ann to arrive before Thanksgiving. When no word came, we sent telegrams to Independence, but received no satisfactory answer. My husband traveled there himself last week and learned that George and my sweet niece left Independence on November 10th. No trace of them has been found since. I fear the worst and pray daily for news. though my heart tells me they are gone from this world. In December 1872, a man named Benjamin Brown failed to arrive at his brother's homestead in western Kansas. Brown had written to his brother stating his intention to travel the Osage Trail and mentioning he would likely stop at a roadside inn along the way. Benjamin Brown was a Union Army veteran who had served with the 10th Kansas Infantry during the Civil War. Military pension records show he had been wounded at the Battle of Prairie Grove and walked with a pronounced limp as a result. He had been traveling to join his brother Samuel, who had established a successful wheat farm near Hays, Kansas. Samuel Brown's affidavit to investigators stated, "Ben wrote that he would leave Independence on December 7th and expected to reach my farm by Christmas. He mentioned that his war injury made travel difficult and that he would likely stop at inns along the way rather than camping rough as he once might have done. When he failed to arrive, I feared he had succumbed to the winter weather or that his old wound had troubled him. Never did I imagine he had fallen victim to murderers." These disappearances created a pattern that few noticed at the time. The isolation of frontier communities meant that news traveled slowly. Each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident rather than part of a larger, more sinister trend. The case that would ultimately lead to the discovery of the Benders' crimes involved Dr. William York from Independence, Kansas. Dr. York disappeared in March 1873 while searching for Launcher and his daughter, who were friends of the York family. Dr. York came from a prominent family. His brothers included Colonel Ed York and Alexander York, a Kansas state senator. When he failed to return home, his family launched a substantial investigation. Dr. York, aged 38, was a respected physician who had established his practice in Independence after serving as a medical officer during the Civil War. His medical journal, recovered from his office, indicated that he had promised Mrs. Launcher before her death that he would look after her husband and daughter. This promise led him to begin searching when news reached him of their disappearance. York's last known communication was a letter to his wife dated March 9, 1873. "I have inquired throughout Cherryvale and learned that George and Mary Ann passed through here last November. Tomorrow I shall travel northeast along the Osage Trail, as several informants suggested they may have taken that route. I expect to return within 3 days. Kiss the children for me." This search would eventually lead to the Bender cabin and the discovery that would shock the nation. The investigation began quietly. Colonel York visited the Bender home in April 1873, inquiring about his brother. Kate Bender, ever charming, expressed sympathy and suggested that Indians or outlaws along the trail might be responsible. She offered to communicate with spirits to help locate the missing doctor. According to Colonel York's later testimony, something about the encounter left him deeply unsettled. In a letter to his wife dated April 9, 1873, Colonel York wrote, "I spoke with the Bender girl today regarding William. She professed to have no knowledge of his whereabouts, but offered to consult the spirits for a fee of $1. I declined her offer. There is something not right about that family." The old woman stared at me throughout our conversation in a manner I found most disturbing. "I shall return tomorrow with the sheriff." When Colonel York returned to the Bender property the following day, accompanied by the township constable, he found the place deserted. This sudden departure raised immediate suspicions, leading to a more thorough search of the property. Meanwhile, travelers who had visited the Bender Inn and survived later reported unusual behaviors. The family insisted that guests sit in specific positions at the table, always with their backs to the curtain. John Sr. or Jr. would often position themselves near the curtain during meals. Kate would engage guests in conversation, drawing their attention. And then, for some, the meal would be their last moment on earth. The method, as reconstructed by investigators, was horrifyingly efficient. While Kate distracted the traveler, one of the male Benders would step behind the canvas curtain. From this position, they would strike the back of the victim's head with a hammer, a blow delivered through the curtain itself. The victim would then be dragged behind the curtain, their throat cut to ensure death, and their body dropped through a trapdoor into a cellar below. Later, under cover of darkness, the bodies would be buried in the orchard behind the cabin. A traveler named William Pickering would later provide crucial testimony. Having stopped at the Bender Inn in February 1873, he noted several peculiarities. In a sworn statement to the Labette County Sheriff, Pickering stated, "I was seated at the table for supper with my back to a canvas partition. The meal was simple: bread, cold meat, and coffee. Throughout the meal, the old man and the son kept moving behind me, which caused me great unease. The daughter engaged me in conversation about my journey and my business. When I mentioned I was a school teacher heading to take a position in Fort Scott and had left my valuables with relatives in Parsons, the family's demeanor changed markedly. They became less attentive, almost dismissive. I left the next morning unharmed, but with a distinct feeling that I had narrowly avoided something unpleasant." Another survivor, Edward Leach, a cattle buyer from St. Louis, stayed at the Bender Inn in January 1873. His account provides additional insight into how the family selected their victims. "During supper, Kate Bender asked pointed questions about my business. When I mentioned I was returning home, having already sold my herd, and deposited the proceeds in the bank at Independence, the old woman made a grunting sound and left the table. The atmosphere became noticeably cooler. I had intended to stay the night, but decided instead to continue on to Cherryvale, despite the late hour. Something in their manner suggested I was no longer welcome once they learned I carried no cash." Pickering's and Leach's accounts suggest that the Benders selected their victims based on perceived wealth and isolation, targeting those carrying valuables and unlikely to be immediately missed. As winter gave way to spring in 1873, the community's concern about missing travelers reached a breaking point. A township meeting was held in the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse in late April to discuss the disappearances. Notably, both John Bender Sr. and Jr. attended this meeting. According to township records, they sat quietly as neighbors discussed forming search parties to investigate the missing persons cases. The minutes of this meeting, preserved in the Labette County Historical Society archives, note that several residents expressed fear about traveling the Osage Trail alone. A proposal was made to establish regular patrols. When asked his opinion, John Bender Sr. reportedly shrugged and said only, "Bad men out there," before falling silent again. Moses Beachy, a Mennonite farmer who attended the meeting, later recalled, "The old Bender sat against the wall, his hat pulled low over his eyes. When talk turned to forming search parties, I noticed him exchange a glance with his son. There was something in that look that struck me as peculiar, though I couldn't say why at the time. Looking back now, I believe they were already planning their escape." Shortly after this meeting, a neighbor noticed that the Benders' livestock was unattended and their cabin appeared abandoned. This observation was reported to township officials on April 27, 1873. When locals entered the property, they found the cabin empty of inhabitants, though personal belongings remained. It appeared the family had fled in haste. What happened next would cement the Benders in American criminal history. The search of the property began in the cabin itself. The smell was the first indicator that something was terribly wrong. A putrid odor emanated from a trapdoor discovered in the floor behind the canvas curtain. In the cellar below, investigators found blood-soaked earth. The cellar itself was shallow, no more than 3 feet deep, and measured approximately 6 feet by 8 feet. The walls were stained dark with what appeared to be dried blood. Leroy Dick, the township trustee who led the initial investigation, would later write in his official report, "The stench arising from this hole was overwhelming, suggesting that bodies had been kept there for some time before burial. The earthen floor was saturated with blood to such a degree that it had the consistency of mud. The sight was enough to turn the strongest stomach. Outside, in the orchard, the ground showed signs of disturbance. The earth had been turned over in several locations, then tamped down and covered with deadfall to disguise the disturbance. An apple tree at the edge of the orchard showed unusual discoloration on its trunk, later determined to be blood splatter. James Johnson, a local farmer who assisted in the initial search, gave this account to the Parsons Eclipse newspaper. "We noticed the ground in the orchard had been disturbed in multiple locations. Using spades, we began to dig in the most recently disturbed area. At a depth of approximately 2 feet, we uncovered a human foot. Continuing our excavation with great care, we revealed the body of a man, face down, his head crushed and his throat cut from ear to ear. The horror of this discovery cannot be adequately expressed in words." Township records document that on May 1, 1873, the first body was exhumed from the Bender property. It was Dr. William York, identified by his brother, Colonel York. The doctor's skull had been crushed and his throat had been cut. The body was found buried face down, approximately 2 feet below the surface. His watch, money, and medical bag were missing. Colonel York's journal entry from that day reads simply, "We found William today. God help me, but I wish we hadn't. No man should have to see his brother in such a state. I have telegraphed Alexander. We will have justice." By the end of the day, 7 more bodies would be discovered in shallow graves throughout the property. All showed similar patterns of injury: hammer blows to the head, followed by throat slashing. The body of George Launcher was found near that of his daughter Mary Ann. The child's remains showed no sign of head trauma, leading investigators to conclude she had been buried alive or strangled. This detail was too horrific for many newspapers to report directly. The Independent's Kansan alluded to it only by stating that the child's fate was perhaps the most terrible of all, having been denied even the mercy of a swift end. Dr. Calvin Ashland, who examined the bodies, wrote in his medical report, "The female child, approximately 8 years of age, shows no evidence of cranial trauma as seen in the adult victims. The cause of death appears to be asphyxiation, either by strangulation or burial while still alive. The condition of the remains makes a more precise determination impossible. That any human being could commit such an act against an innocent child defies comprehension." 3 more bodies would eventually be found, bringing the confirmed victim count to 11. However, some historical accounts suggest the actual number may have been higher, with estimates ranging up to 21 victims. Not all remains could be identified, as decomposition had advanced significantly in some cases. The investigation revealed other disturbing details. The Benders had apparently been stripping victims of valuables before burial. Watches, jewelry, and money were absent from the bodies. Several of the victims were known to have been carrying substantial sums of cash at the time of their disappearances. None of this money was recovered on the property. A search of the cabin revealed a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard in the family's living quarters. Inside were various personal items presumed to belong to victims: a pocket watch with the initials WFM, matching victim W.F. McCrotty, a woman's silver locket containing a braided lock of blonde hair, a man's wedding ring engraved with the date June 11, 1869, and approximately $100 in cash and coins of various denominations. The hammer believed to be the murder weapon was found in a well on the property. The handle showed dark stains, and the head bore trace evidence of hair and tissue. Dr. Calvin Ashland, a physician from Parsons who examined the evidence, noted in his report that the instrument appears well suited to its grim purpose, being heavy enough to cause fatal trauma when wielded with force, yet not so unwieldy as to prevent accuracy. Among the documents found in the cabin was a small notebook, apparently belonging to Kate Bender. Most pages contained unintelligible symbols, possibly related to her spiritualist practices. However, several pages contained what appeared to be a ledger of sorts, with dates and amounts that roughly corresponded to known disappearances. This document, though circumstantial, suggested a level of record-keeping that pointed to premeditation rather than opportunistic violence. The victims represented a cross-section of frontier society. Among the identified were Dr. William York, the physician whose disappearance led to the discovery; York's body was found still wearing the suit in which he had left Independence, though his gold watch and the $500 he was known to be carrying were missing. George Launcher and his 8-year-old daughter Marianne, travelers heading west. Launcher's pockets had been turned inside out, and the $1,500 from the sale of his business was gone. The child's small gold locket, a gift from her mother, had been torn from her neck. Benjamin Brown, a neighbor who had visited the Bender Inn. Brown's Civil War pension papers were found on his body, though the silver identification disc he wore as a veteran had been taken. W.F. McCrotty, identified by papers found on his person. McCrotty was a land surveyor from Clarinda, Iowa, who had been mapping potential railroad routes through the region. His expensive surveying equipment was missing. John Boyle, an Irish laborer. Boyle had been employed by the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad and was carrying his final wages of $60 when he disappeared. The money was not found on his body. Henry Mackenzie, a resident of Parsons, Kansas. Mackenzie was a successful merchant who had been traveling to Independence on business. His ledger books were found among his possessions, but the $700 in cash noted in his final entry was missing. Several unidentified men presumed to be travelers passing through. These victims had no identifying documents, and their decomposed state made identification impossible. They were buried in a common grave in the Parsons Cemetery with a marker reading simply "Unknown Victims of the Benders, 1873. Particularly disturbing was the case of the Launcher child. According to forensic examination conducted at the time, the young girl appeared to have been strangled rather than bludgeoned, and her body showed signs of having been buried alive. This detail was reported in the Parsons Sun newspaper on May 8, 1873, though the paper was careful to couch the information in euphemisms appropriate to Victorian sensibilities. The paper stated only that the child's remains indicated a different fate than the adult victims, suggesting perhaps that even among such depravity, the wielding of the hammer against one so young was considered a step too far. The alternative method of dispatch, however, speaks to an even more disturbing callousness. As news of the discovery spread, thousands of curiosity seekers descended on the Bender property. According to newspaper accounts from May 1873, people traveled from as far as 50 miles away to view the scene of the crimes. Some took souvenirs, pieces of the cabin, blood-stained earth, even splinters from the hammer believed to be the murder weapon. The Independence reporter noted on May 15, 1873, "The scene at the Bender farm has taken on the atmosphere of a macabre carnival. Families arrive by wagon with picnic baskets, viewing the open graves and the blood-stained cabin with expressions of horror and fascination. Enterprising individuals have begun selling refreshments and authentic relics of the murders, though the provenance of such items is highly questionable." James Wilson, a local farmer who visited the site, later recalled, "People came from all around, bringing their children to see where the killings took place. Some would pose for photographs beside the open graves, as if they were at a county fair, rather than a place of such terrible suffering. One man was selling small vials of soil he claimed was soaked with the victim's blood for 50 cents each. Another offered splinters, supposedly from the blood-stained trapdoor, at $1 apiece. The behavior of the crowd seemed nearly as monstrous as the crimes themselves. The cabin itself was eventually dismantled by souvenir hunters. By June 1873, nothing remained of the structure except the stone foundation. The land would remain untilled for decades, considered cursed by locals. But what of the Benders themselves? When the family fled, they took a wagon and team of horses, abandoning another wagon at the property. Railroad records indicate that tickets were purchased in nearby Thayer for 2 women traveling to Humboldt, Kansas. A station agent later identified the women as Kate and Ma Bender from photographs shown to him by investigators. From Humboldt, the trail grew cold. It's believed the family split up to avoid detection. Some accounts suggest that John Sr. and Jr. traveled south toward Texas, while Kate and her mother headed north, possibly into Nebraska or the Dakotas. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in frontier history. Rewards totaling $3,000 were offered by the governor of Kansas and the relatives of victims. Detectives from the Pinkerton Agency were hired. Posse formed and scattered across the frontier. Alexander York, state senator and brother of the murdered doctor, used his political influence to ensure the search received maximum resources. In a speech before the Kansas legislature in May 1873, he declared, "These fiends have made a mockery of frontier hospitality and stained the good name of our state with innocent blood. I pledge my fortune and my honor to seeing them brought to justice." The Pinkerton Detective Agency assigned 5 agents to the case, an unprecedented allocation of resources at the time. Their investigation included following up on reported sightings, interviewing witnesses, and distributing wanted posters throughout the Western Territories. The posters, which survive in various historical archives, offered detailed descriptions of the Benders and the substantial reward for their capture. One such poster reads, "Wanted for murder, $3,000 reward, John Bender, Sr., age approximately 60, 5'9", tall, heavy-set, gray beard, speaks broken English with German accent. Almira Bender, age approximately 55, 5'11", tall, stout build, masculine appearance, speaks little or no English. John Bender, Jr., age approximately 25, 6'0", tall, slender build, light hair, speaks broken English, exhibits signs of mental deficiency. Kate Bender, age approximately 23, 5'6", tall, auburn hair, well-spoken in English, claims to be a spiritualist and healer. Reports of Bender sightings came from across the country: Michigan, New Mexico, California. Every lead was investigated. None proved conclusive. In June 1873, a report came from Fort Smith, Arkansas, that 2 men matching the descriptions of the male Benders had been seen working as laborers on a riverboat. By the time Pinkerton agents arrived, the men had disappeared. In August of the same year, a school teacher in Red Cloud, Nebraska, claimed that Kate Bender had applied for a teaching position under the name Catherine Griffith. When authorities investigated, the woman had already moved on. There are numerous accounts of posses capturing and killing the Benders, but these stories conflict with one another and lack official documentation. Some frontier justice may have occurred, but if so, those responsible kept their actions secret. One persistent story involves a posse led by Colonel York. According to this account, York and several companions tracked the Benders to a remote area near the Texas-New Mexico border. There, they allegedly captured the family and executed them without trial, burying the bodies in unmarked graves. When questioned about these rumors later in life, York reportedly neither confirmed nor denied them, saying only, "The Benders got what they deserved, wherever they got it." James McPherson, who claimed to have been part of York's posse, gave an interview to the Kansas City Star in 1910, shortly before his death. In it, he stated, "We found them camped in a canyon about 20 miles north of the Texas border. It was just before dawn when we surrounded their camp. The old man reached for a rifle and was shot immediately. The others we took alive. I will not describe what happened next, as it is not fit for public consumption. Suffice it to say that justice was served in full measure. We buried them where they fell and swore an oath never to reveal the exact location. Some sins are too great for earthly courts to judge." Another account claims that a vigilante group captured the male Benders near Fort Smith, Arkansas. According to this version, the men were lynched and their bodies were weighted with stones and thrown into the Arkansas River. No contemporaneous newspaper accounts or official records support this claim. The case generated national attention. The New York Times ran an article on May 9, 1873, with the headline, "The Kansas Murders: Shocking Discoveries of Human Remains in Labette County." The article described the Benders as fiends in human shape, and the crimes as without parallel in the annals of crime in this country. The Times correspondent wrote, "The details of these murders, as they have come to light, are so revolting as to seem almost incredible in a civilized country. That an entire family should engage in such wholesale slaughter for the purpose of gain, Dispatching their victims with the cold precision of slaughterhouse workers challenges comprehension. It is as if some medieval horror has been transplanted into the American heartland. Harper's Weekly featured an illustrated cover depicting the Bender cabin and the exhumation of victims. The accompanying article speculated on the psychology that could produce such killers. What darkness must reside in souls that can commit such acts without apparent remorse? The woman Kate, by all accounts intelligent and well-spoken, presents a particular enigma. That feminine refinement and murderous intent could exist within the same breast confounds our understanding of human nature. The Philadelphia Inquirer's editorial on May 12, 1873, reflected the national shock. The Bender case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that beneath the veneer of civilization lurks the potential for savagery that we prefer to believe exists only in far-off, uncivilized lands. That such calculated evil could thrive in the heartland of our nation, perpetrated not by wild Indians or foreign brigands but by a family operating under the guise of frontier hospitality, should give us all pause. Kate Bender became a particular focus of public fascination. Described in newspapers as the female fiend and Hell's Belle, her combination of beauty, charm, and apparent bloodthirstiness captured the Victorian imagination. Dime novels and sensationalist accounts soon appeared, mixing fact with fiction. The Chicago Tribune wrote, "Of all the members of this murderous clan, the daughter Kate presents the most psychological interest. Young, not unhandsome, and possessed of some education, she might have chosen any number of respectable paths. Instead, she appears to have been the primary lure that drew victims to their doom, engaging them in pleasant conversation, even as death literally waited behind a curtain. One wonders what perversion of character or early influence could produce such calculated malevolence in feminine form." A dime novel published in 1874 titled Kate Bender, the Kansas Hell Queen, portrayed her as a seductress who lured men to their deaths through her feminine wiles. While highly fictionalized, such portrayals contributed to the enduring public image of Kate as the driving force behind the family's crimes. In the decades that followed, numerous women were arrested on suspicion of being Kate Bender. None were conclusively identified as the fugitive killer. In 1889, 2 women were arrested in Michigan and brought back to Kansas for trial, suspected of being Ma and Kate Bender. However, witnesses who had known the Benders could not positively identify them, and they were released. This incident, documented in court records from Labette County, represents the closest authorities ever came to resolving the case. Mrs. Frances McCann, who had been a neighbor of the Benders, testified at the hearing. "I cannot say with certainty that these women are the Benders. The older woman bears some resemblance to Ma Bender in build and manner, but her features seem different to my recollection. As for the younger woman, she has neither the height nor the striking appearance of Kate Bender as I remember her." The Michigan women, who gave their names as Sarah Eliza Davis and Mary Gardner, maintained throughout the proceedings that they had never been to Kansas and knew nothing of the Bender murders. After their release, they filed a lawsuit against the state of Kansas for false imprisonment, though court records indicate the suit was eventually dismissed. In 1911, a man named Leroy Dick, who had been the township trustee in 1873 and led the initial investigation of the Bender property, gave a newspaper interview in which he claimed that a vigilante posse had captured the Benders near the Texas border. According to Dick, the posse executed the family and buried them in unmarked graves. However, Dick provided no evidence to support this claim, and many historians consider it dubious. In his interview with the Cherryvale Globe, Dick stated, "I will not name names, for some of those involved still live, but I can say that the Benders received frontier justice. They will never stand before an earthly court because they have already answered to a higher tribunal. Those who dispatched them did so with the grim satisfaction of knowing that no more travelers would fall victim to their hammer." When pressed for details, Dick reportedly said, "Some things are best left unsaid. Let history record only that the Benders vanished, and with them their evil." The truth of the Benders' fate remains unknown. They simply vanished into the vastness of frontier America, their ultimate destiny one of history's unsolved mysteries. What makes the Bender case particularly significant is its timing and context. The American frontier was still being settled. Law enforcement was scattered and often ineffective across vast territories. Communication between jurisdictions was slow and unreliable. These conditions created perfect opportunities for those with murderous intent. The Benders exploited the transient nature of frontier society. Their victims were often people in transition, travelers with no local connections, individuals whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms. The family operated in a geographical and social environment that allowed their killing spree to continue for nearly 2 years before discovery. Professor James Harding of the University of Kansas, writing in the American Historical Review in 1958, noted, "The Bender case represents a dark counterpoint to the traditional frontier narrative. While we celebrate the pioneer spirit and the rugged individualism of Western expansion, the isolation and lawlessness that characterized this period also enabled predators like the Benders to operate with relative impunity. Their crimes exposed the vulnerability that accompanied freedom on the frontier." In 1961, historian Robert Gerard published The Bloody Benders, a documentary analysis, in the Kansas Historical Quarterly. Gerard's research included the discovery of previously unpublished township records and personal letters from Colonel York describing his investigation. These documents provided new insights into the case, particularly regarding the community's reaction to the crimes. According to Gerard's findings, locals had long harbored suspicions about the Bender family, their broken English, possibly feigned in the case of Kate, their reclusiveness, and strange behaviors had marked them as outsiders in a close-knit frontier community. Yet the veneer of normalcy they maintained, operating a legitimate business, attending community meetings, was enough to prevent these suspicions from developing into formal investigation. Gerard uncovered a letter from Thomas Brockman, a local farmer, to his brother in Illinois, dated September 1872. "There is a strange family of Germans settled on the trail about 4 miles from our place. They keep to themselves mostly, except for the daughter who puts on airs above her station. Something ain't right about them. Henson's dog won't go near their property, and animals got better sense about people than most folks do." A particularly disturbing detail emerged from Gerard's research. Township tax records indicated that the Benders had attempted to sell their property in March 1873, just weeks before their crimes were discovered. This suggests they may have been planning their escape, perhaps aware that suspicions were growing too strong to ignore. A document in the county clerk's office showed that on March 19, 1873, John Bender Sr. had inquired about procedures for selling his land claim. The clerk, Samuel Porter, later recalled that Bender seemed anxious to complete the transaction quickly and offered to sell at below market value for immediate payment. In 1967, during construction work near the former Bender property, workers discovered human remains approximately half a mile from the original cabin site. Forensic examination at the time suggested the remains dated to the 1870s. The skeleton was that of a man of approximately 50 years of age, with a crushed skull and cut throat, injuries consistent with the Benders' known method of killing. While it could not be conclusively determined if these were additional Bender victims, the location and time period are suggestive. The case file, stored at the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, was reportedly lost during an office relocation in 1968. Dr. Marcus Phillips, who examined the remains, wrote in his report, "The cranial damage is consistent with a forceful blow from a blunt instrument, likely a hammer or similar tool. The cervical vertebrae show clear evidence of sharp force trauma indicative of throat cutting. The location of these remains, their estimated age, and the nature of the injuries strongly suggests this individual may have been an undiscovered victim of the Bender family. The psychological aspects of the Bender case remain perhaps the most disturbing elements. This was not a single killer operating in secret, but an entire family unit functioning as a murder machine. Each member had a role: Kate as the lure, the men as the killers, Ma possibly handling the bodies and belongings. The coordination required suggests a shared pathology unlike almost anything seen before in American crime. Dr. Lawrence Peterson, a criminal psychologist who studied the case in the 1950s, wrote, "The Bender family represents a rare instance of what might be termed shared psychopathy. While family criminal enterprises are not uncommon in history, the level of violence and the apparent ease with which all members participated in murder sets the Benders apart. One must wonder what familial dynamics produce such unified depravity." Peterson theorized that John Sr. was likely a domineering figure whose own violent tendencies shaped the family's behavior. Ma Bender, he suggested, may have been completely subservient to her husband's will, perhaps having experienced abuse herself. John Jr.'s apparent cognitive limitations may have made him particularly susceptible to his father's influence. As for Kate, Peterson speculated that her intelligence may have made her not a follower, but a driving force behind the family's criminal enterprise, using her charm and social skills to identify and lure potential victims. Kate Bender particularly embodies this psychological complexity. Historical accounts describe her as intelligent and charismatic. She advertised herself as a spiritualist and healer in local newspapers, positions that gave her a kind of authority and trust within the community. Yet behind this facade was a woman who could calmly engage travelers in conversation while knowing they were moments from death. A handbill recovered from the Bender property, presumably distributed by Kate, read, "Miss Katie Bender, spiritual medium and healer, can read your past, present, and future, cures diseases by laying on of hands. Fee 25 cents per consultation." The juxtaposition of this benevolent public persona with her participation in serial murder presents a chilling study in duplicity. The Bender case represents an important transition in American crime and its coverage. While serial killings had certainly occurred before, the Bender murders marked one of the first cases to receive national media attention. The coverage established patterns that would be repeated in later decades. The fascination with female killers, the tendency to sensationalize and mythologize particularly gruesome crimes, the creation of souvenir economies around murder sites. Media historian Dr. Eleanor Winters noted in her 1992 study, Frontier Crime and National Identity, the Bender case arrived at a crucial moment in American media development. The expansion of telegraph networks allowed for rapid dissemination of news across the country. Urban newspapers, competing for readers, seized on the lurid details of the case. The public's fascination with the Benders helped establish true crime as a viable commercial genre in American publishing. The land where the Bender cabin once stood remains private property today. Over the decades, it has changed hands multiple times, with owners often reporting unusual difficulties with the property, crops that won't grow in certain areas, livestock that refuses to graze on specific patches of ground. While these reports likely reflect the psychological impact of knowing the land's history rather than any supernatural influence, they demonstrate how deeply the Bender crimes penetrated the community consciousness. Farmer William Stokes, who owned the property in the 1930s, told the Parson's Sun in 1937, "There's a piece of ground behind where the cabin stood where nothing will grow right. Corn comes up stunted, wheat gets a blight. I'm not a superstitious man, but there's something wrong with that soil. Too much blood soaked into it, I reckon." In the spring of 1873, when the last body was pulled from the Kansas soil, locals burned what remained of the Bender orchard. The fruit trees under which so many victims lay were considered tainted. This symbolic act, the purification by fire, speaks to how profoundly disturbing the community found the murders. The earth itself seemed contaminated. The Reverend Josiah Harper, who presided over a memorial service for the identified victims, wrote in his journal, "Today we committed to consecrated ground those poor souls who met their end in that charnel house on the prairie. The community seems wounded, as if a corruption has been revealed in our midst. Many speak of leaving this place, though the evil was not of our making, but visited upon us by those strangers who called themselves the Benders." The Bender case exists in an uncomfortable space between verified history and frontier legend. The core facts are well documented in contemporary newspaper accounts, official records, and correspondence. Yet around these facts has grown a body of folklore, tales of Kate's supernatural powers, claims of additional victims, stories of vigilante justice. Separating fact from fiction becomes increasingly difficult as the decades pass. Local folklore includes accounts of Kate practicing not just spiritualism, but actual witchcraft. Some stories claim she could cast spells on travelers, rendering them compliant before they were killed. Other tales suggest that Ma Bender possessed superhuman strength, allowing her to move bodies with ease. These supernatural embellishments, while unsupported by historical evidence, speak to the community's need to make sense of seemingly senseless violence. What remains undisputed is that for approximately 2 years, travelers disappeared along the Osage Trail near the Bender property. When investigated, these disappearances led to the discovery of at least 11 bodies buried on the property, all bearing similar fatal injuries. The Bender family fled before they could be apprehended and were never conclusively found. The rest, the precise number of victims, the ultimate fate of the killers, the deeper motivations behind the murders, remains in the realm of speculation and historical detective work. The Bender family's murderous efficiency suggests they may have had practice before arriving in Kansas. Some historians have attempted to trace their movements prior to 1870, looking for similar patterns of disappearances along migration routes. However, the limited record-keeping of the era and the common nature of the Bender name make such connections difficult to establish with certainty. Historian Patricia Coleman, in her 1985 book, Before the Hammer, Tracing the Bender Family, proposed that the Benders may have operated in Ohio and Indiana before moving to Kansas. Coleman identified several unsolved disappearances along travel routes in those states during the late 1860s that shared characteristics with the Kansas murders. However, without conclusive evidence linking the Benders to these earlier crimes, such theories remain speculative. What's particularly chilling about the Bender case is how it reveals the dark potential of the American frontier experience. The same isolation and self-reliance that drew many settlers west also created perfect conditions for predators. The dream of reinvention that propelled westward expansion also allowed individuals to shed their pasts and create new identities, sometimes with malevolent intent. The Bender family existed in a liminal space between civilization and wilderness, between law and lawlessness, between the known and unknown. Their roadside inn stood as a perverse parody of frontier hospitality, transforming what should have been a haven for travelers into a slaughterhouse. In this sense, the Bender story serves as a dark counterpoint to the romanticized narrative of Western expansion. For every pioneer seeking honest opportunity, there were those who saw in the frontier a chance to prey upon others with minimal risk of consequences. As we conclude this documented account of the bloody Benders, we're left with more questions than answers. The incompleteness of the case, the unidentified victims, the unclear motivations, the unknown fate of the perpetrators, creates a narrative void that has been filled with speculation for nearly 150 years. Perhaps this is why the case continues to fascinate. It remains unresolved, a bloody chapter in American history that never received proper closure. The Benders emerged from obscurity, committed their atrocities, and then vanished back into the shadows of history, leaving behind only shallow graves and lingering questions. The prairie has long since reclaimed the land where the Bender cabin stood. Seasons have turned, generations have passed, and the physical evidence of their crimes has been erased by time. Yet the story persists in historical records, in local lore, and in the darker corners of American criminal history. In 1954, the Labette County Historical Society erected a small marker near the site of the Bender property. The inscription reads simply, "The Bender Tragedy, 1873." This understated memorial stands as perhaps the most fitting epitaph for a case characterized by what remains unknown and unresolved. Mrs. Eleanor Tate, who was present at the marker's dedication, was quoted in the Parson's Son, "My grandmother lived not 5 miles from here when it all happened. She used to tell us children about it on winter nights, and we'd huddle closer to the fire, scared half to death. It's strange to think that something so terrible happened in this peaceful place. Just goes to show you never really know what's happening behind closed doors." In the silence of the Kansas prairie, where wind once carried the sounds of travelers on the Osage Trail, the echoes of the Bender murders can still be felt, not as supernatural presence, but as historical shadow, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the imagined beasts of folklore, but ordinary humans driven by greed, opportunity, and a profound absence of empathy. The Bender family may have escaped human justice, but they could not escape history's judgment. They remain fixed in American memory as pioneers of a different sort, harbingers of a uniquely American form of evil that would reappear throughout the nation's history, from H. Holmes to the Manson family. And somewhere perhaps in unmarked graves or under assumed names, the Benders themselves returned to dust, taking their secrets with them into eternity. To this day, travelers driving through Labette County sometimes pull over near where the Bender property once stood. They stand in the Kansas wind, looking out over peaceful farmland, trying to reconcile the bucolic scene before them with the horrors it once witnessed. This pilgrimage, part historical curiosity, part morbid fascination, ensures that the bloody Benders of Kansas will never be completely forgotten. In 1959, during an oral history project conducted by the University of Kansas, elderly resident Martha Wilson recalled, "My father was one of the men who helped dig up those poor souls from the Bender place. He never spoke of what he saw there, not once in all the years after. But sometimes at night I'd hear him get up and pace the floor till dawn. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen." As long as people are drawn to the darker chapters of human experience, as long as we seek to understand the capacity for evil that lies within ordinary appearances, the Bender family will maintain their grim place in American memory. Listen closely enough, and you might hear the echo of a hammer striking through canvas, the last sound many travelers heard before darkness claimed them on that remote Kansas prairie where hospitality became a mask for horror, and where the American dream twisted into an American nightmare.